All right, good afternoon. We are at the 1 o'clock mark and our webinar is actually starting. My name is Tawanda Clark Edgom, the Chief Program Officer here at Gwen's Girls, but I'll also be the facilitator for our webinar today, Abolishing the Child Welfare System. So as you were coming in, we always like to do things the GG way. We are a sanctuary certified model. So we start off with a community meeting. So if you would, let us know who you are, what organization you're from, and give us one feeling word as we're getting started. As you're coming in the chat, you can put your name, organization, give us one feeling word to get started. And you will also see within the next 5 seconds, you'll see a post that will pop up in front of you on screen. There are about 5 questions. If you would, we're going to keep you busy for this session. We want you to answer those 5 questions at the beginning, and you'll see 5 questions that will come up again at the end. Just a pre-polling question that 5 questions that we are going to ask you. So you're busy, you're telling us how you're feeling, your name, your organization. And you're also putting here, you're going to complete this poll, 5 questions, and then I'll get ready to introduce our dynamic panel in just a few seconds. So I see people are coming in, and I'm glad that you're with us. Cecilia, glad that you're here with us. All right. Sarah, I'm glad you're here. Tamia, thank you for coming. And after you put your name, organization, and your feeling word in the chat, please go ahead and take about 5 seconds, 5 minutes to complete the poll that is here. And we'll leave that up for a while. Go ahead and we'll get started probably about 1:05. We're at 1:02 now. So you shouldn't take you long to answer the questions and put the information in the chat. But I want to make sure that I keep us on track with our panel today, because we do have a dynamic panel and a dynamic topic to discuss today. And for those of you that didn't catch it, my name is Tawanda Clark Edgom, the Chief Program Officer here at Gwen's Girls, also the facilitator for today's session. And as you're coming in, I'm going to ask that you put your name, organization, a feeling word, and then take a few minutes to fill out the poll for us. There's 5 questions on the poll. I'm going to ask that you take a few minutes to fill that out. I see people are saying they feel focused, intrigued. I'm intrigued too, if I might say. This is a topic that I am intrigued about and eager to discuss with our panel of experts. So I'm excited about that today as well. Going to give you another few minutes to come in, introduce yourself, put your information in the chat, and take a few minutes to fill out the poll. It's about 5 questions, so it shouldn't take you long. And we're going to get started at about 1:05. And I am not able to vote, but you certainly are. So please do so. All right. And I see people are still coming in. So we're going to give you another couple minutes to introduce yourself and put your information in the poll. People are saying they're curious. This is a new topic. I know we don't hear much about this, particularly those of us that have been in child welfare for 25 years or more, like myself. And so who really have a passion for children and families. I'm looking for a way to do things better. Maybe that means doing it differently than we've done it before. And our panelists are certainly here to talk to us about what that's going to look like today. So great, hopeful, absolutely. Thank you, Marsha, for sharing that. I am hopeful too. Things can only get better. And so we'll be discussing what that looks like today. Take a few minutes to fill out the poll. You have about 1 more minute to fill that out. It's only 5 questions, so it shouldn't take you long. If you're just coming in and you didn't catch what I said, my name's Tawanda Clark Edgom, the Chief Program Officer here at Gwen's Girls and the facilitator of this dynamic panel that we have today. So take a few minutes, tell us who you are, where you're from, and also take the last minute to fill out the poll before we close it out and get ready to introduce our panelists for today. All right. We have about 1 more minute. If you haven't done so as of yet, please go ahead and complete the poll. This gives us an opportunity to gauge the temperature in the room to see where we're at around this discussion. All right. So we are at 1:05. And I'm going to ask Amy at this time to go ahead and close out the poll with whomever we have that is answered, so we can take a look at the questions in the poll. All right. So we have 19% of the people who say they're very comfortable with this topic around child welfare. Do you feel that the child welfare system can be fixed? Well, we have about 22% of the people who say it's beyond repair. 44% of the people say I'm not sure. And then 33% of the people say it can be fixed. Those are my hopeful people. Absolutely. Number 3, why are the majority of child welfare cases referred? 11% say abuse. 74% say neglect allegations, and 15% say I'm not sure. Well, we're certainly going to talk about that today. And do you believe that the abolishing the child welfare system is the best way to proceed? 48% of the people say yes, and 52% of the people say no. So let's see what happens when we finish our conversation today, if we maybe change a couple of the thought processes around some of the people that voted. Thank you, in fact, for taking the time to do the poll today so that we could gauge the temperature of the room. We certainly do appreciate that. We have a dynamic group of panelists today. We have Dr. Alan Detlef that's with us, Maya Pendleton, and Joyce James. And I'm going to give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell you who they are and actually how they came to embrace this concept of abolishing the child welfare system. So Dr. Detlef, Alan, can you please start us off? Tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to embrace this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, just thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel today. I always enjoy sharing space with Maya and Joyce. So I came to this work as, well, my career started as a Child Protective Services caseworker in Texas under Joyce's leadership in the mid-1990s. And my job, I worked for the system for about 6 years, and my job was always in frontline investigation. So my job was to remove children from their families, investigate allegations of abuse, and then remove children from their families, which I did many times. And the reason I did that so many times is because when you're working in the system never talks about how harmful those removals are. The system never talks about the overrepresentation of Black children, or they didn't in those days when I was in the system. It wasn't until I left the system where I realized the harm that I was complicit in causing and how harmful the child welfare system is. So I went into an academic career and studied racism in the system and how racism impacts disproportionate outcomes for children, and then spent many years, probably 15 years, in academia as someone who worked within systems in Texas and then in Illinois when I was at the University of Illinois in Chicago, trying to reform the system, and ultimately realized that reforms are, one, they don't work, two, they're just simply not sufficient. Because of the harm the system causes, which I know we'll get into later, and started to study abolitionist movements, and ultimately came to the decision a few years ago that reforms just fundamentally don't work, and abolition is the only solution to ending the harm that the child welfare system causes.
Thank you for sharing that. I know when our conversation before this actual panel, I was quite surprised to hear you say that no, we need to do something completely different. And so for me, that was new information. So I'm certainly interested in hearing how that is going to play out. And so Maya, tell us a little bit about yourself. Thank you, Dr. Detlef, for sharing with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Maya Pendleton. I'm coming to this work mostly from a policy background. So I started off in the field of public policy, really interested specifically in how systems are organized to treat Black communities. I'm also a gender studies person, so I was really interested in how Black women, especially Black women with children, were experiencing public systems as a whole. From then, I started working in community-based organizations, working directly with youth, older youth in particular, in foster care, and working a lot with youth who are aging out of foster care. So I was able to really see the impact of the system and hear their perspectives about their involvement in the child welfare system from there. So I worked a lot with young moms and moms who had children who were eventually going back into the system. And so I think that hearing a lot of those direct experiences really shaped my perspective about the child welfare system. And so I started pretty hopeful that, you know, as a policy person, I could sort of work in public policy and be a part of these reforms and change the system and make it so that we were supporting children. And then so I think as a part of my own personal political journey and some of the organizing work I was involved in DC, I became really open to the idea of prison abolition. And I would say at first I was, you know, very open to that, curious, didn't fully understand it. So I've been, you know, there with a lot of folks who are like, this sounds interesting, I'm frustrated, but I don't know what to do about it. And as I just worked with organizers, studied abolition more deeply, I, you know, became a prison abolitionist. And through that work, I started seeing how the child welfare system is organized in similar ways to other systems that criminalize families and communities. And that really set me on a path of understanding that if I really wanted to see, which is what I think we all want to see. We want to see children and communities healthy, and we want to see them thriving, and we don't want to see them being traumatized and oppressed, that this system has to go. And so that is my orientation to the work, and it's been a journey. And so one thing that I'll say is that if some of these ideas feel scary to you, recognizing that, but being open and sort of thinking about your own journey along it as you hear these stories, I think has been really helpful for me in shaping my own journey.
Thank you, Maya, for sharing that. And I won't say that it's scary to me, but I will definitely say it's a new concept of someone that has definitely been indoctrinated in the child welfare system for over 25 years and who really was a part of a system who thought that they were making corrections and doing things a little bit better. I like the idea and the concept around what I heard you say is listening to children, listening to families, and making a difference based on what they say. So thank you for sharing that. Happy to have you here today. And now, Joyce James, I can't say I've had the opportunity, you know, excuse me if I fan out just a little bit, because I've had the opportunity to sit under your work on many occasions. I've learned so much from you in your training, and it has really impacted my life in a way that I have definitely learned to turn that mirror within and to make differences there. So I'm going to ask you to share with the group, those people who don't know you, although I'm sure that there may be a lot of people here who do already know who you are, but share a little bit about, you know, yourself and the work and how you came to embrace this concept and actually have people that are supporting it as well.
Thank you. And thanks to Gwen's Girls. Congratulations to 20 years of great service in, you know, changing outcomes for Black girls. I've been a social worker for 40 plus years. And, you know, my experience in child welfare is that I worked my way up from being a caseworker to actually being the first African-American to lead Texas Child Protective Services. And what I have known from the first day or the first job is that I struggled from day one to understand the harm that I immediately saw when I came to work in the system. And, you know, in my early years, I was not clear of the why of the harm of, in particular, children, Black children disproportionately represented in foster care, because that's what my caseload reflected. Older Black teens that I would put in my car and travel long distances across the state of Texas and drop them off in facilities where I never would have wanted my own children to be, but I did it day after day. And, you know, I have to own that the why for me for a long time was clouded with the lies that shaped how we supposedly worked in the best interests of children. And that has clouded the thinking of many, many people. And what I have come to understand is that those lies still live and breathe in the very fabric and culture of all of our systems and institutions, not just child welfare, but, you know, education, juvenile justice, housing, health, employment, you name it. The collective impact of these systems is actually, you know, killing and destroying our families. And so I made a commitment about 25 years ago that I would do everything within my power to expose the lies and to reshape the thinking inside of systems. And that was, my thoughts around that were very much grounded in undoing racism principles. And I came to understand that what we were dealing with was not broken systems. We were dealing with systems that were set up and designed to do exactly what they were doing. And I would suggest that today, that's still what our systems are doing. And so, my thoughts about abolishing the system, I definitely agree that that's the upstream work that we have to do. We have to define the path to doing that, right? We definitely have to do it because children should not grow up in systems and institutions. They should grow up in families. And when institutions are accountable, we will provide families and children and communities with what they need so that we don't continue to be the worst parents that I know. And I say we because I worked in child welfare for 30 years, and child welfare systems are the worst parents that I know. We raise children who have the worst outcomes of any population. And then when you add race to that, it becomes much more profound. And so I'm definitely in agreement that change is necessary, that all the work that we have done to really try to reform and transform systems is that it works for a little while, but then legislators have a short memory in terms of holding systems accountable. And the resistance of systems is such that they just revert back. They push back harder. The harder we push, the harder they push back. And so even the little work that we've been able to be successful in doing has been dismantled every time.
Absolutely. I think you make a very significant point when you talk about the fact that child welfare systems don't make good parents. I don't think that there is a child advocate that would disagree with you in that. We know that child welfare systems do not make great parents. And very often, you're right, when we remove children from homes, we do see that the outcomes fare poorly. And so I remember, again, I'll go back to Alan and in our previous conversations, my initial thought was around how do we rebuild or make better the system that we already had? And he had to continuously say to me, no, we have to tear it down. So I'm going to go to you, Alan, and I'm going to say, Joyce, thank you. Thank you for sharing how you came to this work. But Alan, I am going to ask you, advocates will often say that the child welfare system is doing what it was designed to do. So can you talk a little bit around this theory and exactly what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, let me say that the history of the child welfare system is very long and complex. We could spend a whole webinar just on the history of the system. So I'll give a brief overview of that. But the most important thing I think to keep in mind is that the history of separating Black children from their families in the United States began during the time of human chattel slavery. And that was a very intentional strategy used by white people to maintain fear, to maintain oppression, to keep Black people in the place where they were supposed to be and keep white people in power. Following abolition of slavery is right around the time when the very earliest origins of the child welfare system began, as well as many other government systems. And as is the case with all of those other systems, and the child welfare system included, those systems began as a means of maintaining the white supremacy that was now threatened following abolition of slavery. So the child welfare system largely began through the orphan train movement, which was a movement started by a reverend in New York City to address mostly white children, although they largely weren't called white at that time, but mostly white children who were living on the streets, living in poverty, and were engaging in petty crimes and becoming a nuisance to other people in the community. And Charles Loring Brace, this reverend, had the idea of taking these children off the streets and moving them to the rapidly expanding West, where they could be used for their labor, but also housed with rural farm families as a way of teaching them the moral values that they needed, or that he believed they needed. So that started a system that is now similar to foster care, where children who were deemed to be in need were taken and moved to a host home. So you'll hear people say then that the orphan train movement from about the mid 1800s to about the 1920s, 1930s relocated and rescued over 200,000 children off of the streets of New York City. What people usually don't say is that the orphan train movement rescued and moved 200,000 white children off the streets of New York City, because Black children were intentionally excluded from that entire movement. So what we see is that the system was its earliest origins designed to rescue or save white children from poverty, while intentionally excluding Black children from those services in order to keep them living in poverty or keep them oppressed. Then between like the 1930s and the 1960s, we saw the modern child welfare system begin to form. And we saw the system shift during those years from a system that was focused on poverty relief for white families to a system that took on a more punitive role. We saw research studies about battered child syndrome come out that largely influenced the public narrative and understanding of serious physical abuse. That led to mandatory reporting laws. And we saw the system evolve into a system that was largely based on a model of surveilling families, identifying abuse, doing investigations, and then a rapid expansion of foster care services. When that shift happened, that's when we saw Black children start to enter the system very rapidly. And by the mid 1970s, we saw that Black children were overrepresented in the system. So now that the system shifted to a more punitive kind of system, we saw that rather than excluding Black children from the system was over-involving Black children. But again, for the purpose of maintaining their oppression. And I say that because consider the outcomes of child welfare services, and specifically foster care. Children in foster care are at risk for a host of adverse outcomes as adults: homelessness, poverty, low educational attainment, joblessness, substance use disorders, involvement in the criminal punishment system, incarceration. All of the things that maintain the oppression of Black families in the United States are the outcomes of child welfare services. And child welfare knows that it's doing that. Child welfare systems know that they're causing those issues in Black families. And they know that they're doing that disproportionately to Black families, and they continue to do that. People often say that these are unintended consequences of certain laws and policies, but when a system knows it's causing harm, knows it's causing harm, greater harm to Black children, and they keep doing it, that's not an unintended consequence. That's intentionally making intentional decisions, developing policies in an intentional manner for the purpose of maintaining the oppression of Black children and families, which is what family separations have been used to do for over 400 years in this country.
It's interesting because earlier when we had this conversation and I talked about the outcomes as a result of children aging out of the system, you told me, no, it's not a result of children aging out of the system. It's a result of children being a part of the system. And you talked about the policing of families. I remember that just ringing in my head, this whole concept of policing of families. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that before I go into something else, because I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. In the abolition movement, many of us describe the system as the family policing system rather than calling it the child welfare system. And that's very intentional. The child welfare system is the language that the state has given us because they want us to believe that they're concerned about children's welfare. And they've been very successful in creating a public narrative that they're helping children. Most people think that the system is helping children and families in need. You know, one of your poll questions asked what was the reason most children came into the system, and it looks like this audience of people understand that this is not a system that's really responding to children who are being harmed. This is a system that's removing children from their parents, mostly poor Black children, because of issues related to poverty. So what we actually see the system is, it's a massive system of surveillance and regulation, all for the purpose of maintaining social control, which is the same purpose as policing and prisons exist. Police in this country began as a way of regulating the behavior of slaves and punishing runaway slaves. And we see the same functions now being used by the child welfare system. So we define the system as the family policing system because their main functions are to surveil families, to regulate their behavior to conform to a white middle-class parenting standard, and then to punish families when they don't conform to the standard that the system sets for them. When you think about it, the system removes most children due to issues of poverty, but the system actually has no resources to address those issues of poverty. They remove children for poverty reasons, and then they send them to things like parenting classes, or the parents to parenting classes, anger management classes, psychological evaluations, all of these things that have nothing to do with the reasons that they came in. So it's this massive system of surveillance, regulation, punishment, which is the same thing that the police do. We also talk about the logic as being the same, which Maya referenced a little bit in our introduction, which we call a carceral logic. The idea is that both prisons, policing, and child welfare individualize problems and punish people for problems like poverty, like homelessness. About 10% of children who are in foster care because they don't have a home, because they don't have a place to live. Poverty, homelessness, those are societal problems that the government has solutions to, but chooses to not implement them. The government could end policy today if they wanted to, legislatively. They choose not to. So rather than doing that, we blame parents for being poor, and we say they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And if they don't, we punish them. If they engage in what the state calls crime, we incarcerate them. If they're not able to feed or house their children, we take their children away from them. All as a means to distract the rest of us from the fact that it's actually the government who is failing those families by choosing to not act.
Right. And I know we hear a lot of people say, well, in the old days, if a family was struggling to take care of their kids, other family members would support, other neighbors would support. And we've in some degree created a kinship model here in Allegheny County. But I get it. It's not the same as keeping children at home with their families and providing those supports around poverty to help families sustain themselves and to be able to take care of their children. So I want to talk a little bit about, in hearing you say everything that you said about, this family policing. I know that you've, started this movement, or there's been a movement that's generated called the Up In movement. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that. And how do you decline child welfare abolition?
Yeah, well, the Up In movement began in late 2019 with Maya and with some other colleagues with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, where we were thinking about ways that we could revitalize the conversation about racial disproportionality, the overrepresentation of Black children, which we felt had been declining in recent years. People weren't talking about it in the way that they were talking about it in the mid-2000s, early 2010s. And we started talking about all of our experiences in implementing reform efforts in child welfare systems to try to address disproportionality, to try to reduce disproportionality. And ultimately, we realized that the reason why those forms are never successful, or the reason why they, like Joyce said, move the needle a little bit, but then leadership changes and it just goes back to being like it was, the reason those reforms are never successful is because they never address the foundational harm of what the system is built upon, which is the forcible involuntary separation of children from their families. We know that forcible separation of children from their families causes immense harm to children. In recent years, many people have realized that when they see that happening at the US-Mexico border. The same harm and trauma that everyone has been outraged about when children are taken from their mothers at the border is the same harm and trauma that children and families experience every day when those children are removed by family policing agents. We know that that causes immense trauma to children. We know that spending time in foster care leads to all of these poor outcomes: housing, poverty, homelessness, incarceration. It's fundamentally a system that causes harm, and as I said, was designed to cause harm. One of your poll questions said, can the system be fixed? The system can't be fixed because the system isn't broken. The system is doing what it was designed to do from its very earliest origins, which is keeping Black people down, keeping Black people in their place, and experiencing the conditions that maintain their oppression. That doesn't mean that individual actors in the system always know that that's what they're participating in, but that's what the system is doing. So it's fundamentally a system that causes harm. When we implement reforms without addressing that harm, we're just kind of tinkering a little bit with the edges. We're trying to make it a little bit less racist of a system, a little bit less harmful of a system. But prison abolitionists, when they think of reform, they usually think of reforms as being designed to create nicer, friendlier cages. But nicer, friendlier cages are still cages. So we can reform the system, make it a little bit better, but it's still fundamentally causing harm, which is why those of us in the abolitionist movement don't support efforts that the system's currently engaging in to achieve what the system calls racial equity. If the system were to achieve racial equity, that still means that hundreds of thousands of children are forcibly separated from their parents. They're just distributed equitably by race. Equitable harm is still harm. None of us should be aspiring to that, which is why we think that abolition is the only solution, because until this agency just completely ceases to exist, until the state no longer has the power to forcibly separate children from their families, that harm is going to continue, and that harm is going to continue to be disproportionately inflicted on Black children and families.
So I won't argue. After being in child welfare for 25 years, I can definitely say that I agree, and I can attest to the harm that I've seen the system willingly or unwillingly do to children. But some might argue that this is slightly radical. So I'm going to go to you, Maya, and I'm going to ask you, how is this done in practice? What does this look like in real life? And what do we say to those people that are saying, this is a radical move? What do we say?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a few things to say. So I like to start with, it's something that abolitionist and author Derricka Pennell says, she's talking about the police, but I think it really applies to most of our systems. And she says, we are now living within institutions and laws and a society that was created and imagined by colonizers and people that were out to oppress us. And so if we think about it like that, then it doesn't feel that radical to say, well, maybe what we have is not working, right? Like, it is radical in that it's grasping at the root, to use Angela Davis's definition of radical. It is radical, but it's not a far leap to say that if we are living within the social constructs and the laws and the police and these systems that are governed by people who were literally enslaving people, then we should maybe think of a different way. And so I really like to start there in getting people to understand why abolition is so necessary. But I would also say that abolition is in a lot of ways inherently experimental. I'm most excited about abolition because I think that it gives us opportunities to try different things. You know, we have always sort of tried to work within systems and use their tools to do something new. But I think that a lot of us have not tried to work outside of systems and to do things new. And to put a finer point on that, I think that a lot of times it looks like how we handle conflicts within our own families and our own communities. We don't have children in our families that we're having conflicts with and say, well, I'm going to put you in an institution. We don't do that to our own babies. So the fact that we think that that is okay to do to others' children, we sit down, I know my family does as a family, and we work things out. We might bring people in to help us and guide us through those things, but we work things out and make sure that we are solving problems in ways that center healing and accountability and that don't harm each other. So often, you know, abolition can become overwhelming for folks because they're like, well, what do we do with all these kids? But I think when we start small and think about, well, what would we do with our own children? Or how do I engage in my own community as a better neighbor? Do I know my neighbors? Would I know who to call if something happened to one of my neighbors? And we start thinking like that and start thinking about what it means to actually be in community with each other and to care for people. Then I don't think that we necessarily jump to, we can't do anything, this is the current system we need. I think that we think about what are solutions to poverty? How do we feed people? I do a lot of mutual aid work, and much of that, it sounds fancy, but I'm knocking on doors and I'm delivering groceries, making sure that kids have food to eat. I'm asking people what they're seeing in their community. I'm asking people what they're concerned about. I'm telling people where they can go for resources. I know that during COVID, we were standing in line every day getting our 2 tests that were free and redistributing those in communities. So a lot of the times it looks like care, it looks like knowing your neighbors, it looks like showing up for people and not being afraid. And on the policy level, it also means a commitment to ending policies that are harming people, to ending poverty, to ending homelessness, and to be willing to have big conversations about why violence is happening in our communities. Why are we harming each other, and what solutions do we have within each other outside of the state to make sure that harm doesn't happen? And so I'll stop there, but I want to say that a lot of the times it sounds much bigger than it is, but I think of abolition as almost 1,000 different experiments in many communities and people figuring out what works for their community. I don't think that there's a one size fits all answer, because all historical contexts and social contexts are different. But I think that that does mean, as policy people, as people who care about children, as organizers, it means that we're putting our heads together and thinking hard about what our community is asking for, what do they need, and how do we provide it to them.
Right. I would agree that part of the problem with the child welfare system is that there is this need to go in and fix people when we haven't asked them what do they need. We want to go in and immediately make changes. And then when those changes do not appear to be sustainable because they were our changes instead of what the community or the family needed, that creates problems and that creates challenges for the system and for workers a lot of times. So Joyce, thank you so much for sharing that. You raise a lot for me there that I'm going to come back to, but I do want to touch on a few things with Joyce, because I do want to go back to, we know the why behind it, but I do want to go back to the how again. And I know that you've, certainly given us some examples of some ways that we can get started by having those big conversations. I think that child welfare has looked at a lot of different things throughout the years in terms of, I know Joyce came and did a lot of work with us in Allegheny County around reducing the number of Black children, Black girls specifically, that were in congregate care settings. And we were able to, minimize those numbers significantly when we focused on that being the change. So when I hear you say this whole idea about, having these conversations, I believe it's possible if we're willing to focus on what needs to be done in order to actually make the change. But Joyce, you indicated earlier in the conversation around, the systemic change. And the challenges that come with that. We get new leadership, we, get a new thought process that comes in, and it may take us back, from where we started from. Can you elaborate a little bit more around that, around how do we get around, if we do get new leadership, how do we make things more sustainable? And when we're talking about this, we're talking about actually tearing down this system completely. And I have to put that in my mind, because I keep looking at a way to reform it, but I get it. You're saying that we can't reform the system the way that it is because it's been set up to do what it's doing. And so we need a whole, not new system, but we need a whole nother approach to the way that we are or approaching families and communities. So what do we do? I'm going to ask you, what do we do?
Well, I think we have to, really understand something Alan mentioned, that we're still dealing with the lack of human value and worth when it comes to Black children, families, their communities. We're dealing with that all the way back to the days of enslavement, and systems continue to reinforce the lack of value and worth of Black children, youth, and families in their relationships with these systems, and in the outcomes that every system and institution produces for the same population of people, right? So you can look across juvenile justice and child welfare and education and health and housing and employment, and the same people experience the racial inequities. And I just want to say that, to me, we have to be clear about what racial equity means. And for me, it doesn't mean that we have the representation in the general population represented in the foster care system. And sometimes people try to divert away from the real issues by saying, oh, it's not about what the system is doing to Black children, youth, and families. It's just that we're not paying enough attention to white children, and they are underrepresented. I don't buy that, and I don't work from that approach. I want people to understand the racial inequities because I want them to see how the relationship and experiences are for people in systems based on race. And when we have a clearer understanding of that, we can see that often in the same instances, when all of the factors are the same, race becomes a predictor of our outcomes in systems and institutions. And they send us messages because we're not told the truth about the history. And so the messages that we get say that the reason why Black children are disproportionately represented is somehow because it's all about their parents, right? And so if that's how we train and socialize people, then we come to our work with that belief. And so that's a piece that is deeply embedded in the very fabric of the system. And it's like we created a new narrative really back in 1964. We were told that racism died with the stroke of a pen when the civil rights legislation was signed. And then suddenly the narrative changed that, you know, opportunity existed for everyone, right? And so after that, if people were poor, it was no longer because of racism. It became because they're lazy and like living off of government assistance and spending our tax dollars. And we embed that thinking inside of the people. The system sends those messages. And so if we come socialized to those beliefs, we come already thinking about which communities are more dangerous, which families are more likely to abuse, which youth are more criminal, and all of that. And then systems send people to the communities ill-equipped to understand and get in touch with how we've been socialized, to the extent that if I'm a child welfare caseworker and I've been told all of these horrific things about some of the communities where we're more likely to remove children from, then I'm scared for my own life going into that community. And like Alan said, it's not a conscious kind of thing. We have so internalized the message and placed the stigma and characterized people in communities where we disproportionately remove children from, that when I'm in sessions talking to staff and saying, how do you get socialized to go into those communities? We're told, don't go at night, don't go by ourselves, right? We need to make sure we put our purses in the trunk before we get there. Don't wear nice jewelry. Wear comfortable shoes, spot your exit as soon as you get in the house. And so if I go with that, then if I'm not safe, surely these children are not safe. And so there's a mentality that also contributes to this, that's rooted and grounded in racism. And I have yet to see a system that has fully embraced the history and impact that institutional and structural racism has on a system that was not designed to serve Black children, youth, and families. And so I wholeheartedly believe that we have to find the path to abolishing the system. And part of that is for systems to really shift in terms of how we train and prepare staff to work with children, youth, and families, so that we start to create a path where children stay in their own homes, stay in their own families, right? And then we have to work on the children who I say are already in the water, right? Because we already have so many children who are in the child welfare system that we can't just today say, okay, let's just abolish the system. And I don't think anybody's saying that. And what do we do with the kids that are already there? But we are not doing nearly enough to get to where we need to be to ensure that children grow up in their families and in their communities and not in systems and institutions that have continued to do the harm that is just really, and then it recreates harm, because children who grow up in our systems often grow up to become parents whose children are also becoming involved in the system, because we have not done the work to reduce the trauma, to eliminate the harm, and to ensure that families have what they need to raise their children safely. Most of the children who are removed because of neglect should never have been removed from their homes. Poverty. Why are people poor, right? People are poor because government systems help to keep them poor. If you're on government-assisted programs and you get a job to try to lift yourself out of poverty, you lose many of the benefits that you need to be able to support your family and your children. And then when child welfare removes your children, you lose your benefits. Then we say you have to have those things to get your children back. And so it's just really a cycle of harm that has to stop. And it needs to start with the recognition that we are living in institutions that breed and still exist around racism, which most people don't even want to have a conversation about institutional and structural racism and the harm that it does, because we have internalized it to the extent that most people can't even see what they're doing. And social workers aren't even required to have an analysis and an understanding of racism to go into any of the helping systems and to supposedly work in the best interest of children, youth, and families.
So you touched on a couple of things when we talk about systemic change. We really have to look at where we're at and probably start from the bottom and work our way up, or start from the top and work our way down, or start all over again, is what I'm hearing you say.
Well, I believe we have to do both to get to where we ultimately want to get to. Is that we have to do the back end work while we're pushing upstream to make the necessary changes that will no longer require us to depend on systems. And I call that fences that have to be removed. But we can't remove them if we can't see them. And more often than not, people will tell you that they would never work in ways that would cause harm to children and families. And because our institutions have not been accountable for helping the people who work inside to get in touch with the ways in which we do harm, we continue to do harm. And so we have to undo the harm for those who are already there, work to do the upstream work that remove all of the barriers that create that trajectory into child welfare.
Okay. So you said a lot. I want to ask you about what is your methodology when you're working with child welfare systems? You've had a lot of success in working with systems. I know in Allegheny County, we were very successful in really looking at disproportionality, and part of the reason why we're having these conversations and continuing to have them. We really looked at how do we, again, keep young people from touching the child welfare system. And we, lo and behold, found that there were family and community connections that young people could, in fact, be a part of. Some of the earlier work involved training where workers had to actually go through the communities that they were taking children from and see what the communities and the people were about before they made those decisions. But can you talk about some of your successes in the work that you've done? I know you've been a lot of places before you came to Allegheny County, but you certainly impacted me there.
Yeah, and I'm still, I left state government in 2013. I was instrumental in getting legislation passed in Texas. Texas was the first state in the country to have legislation requiring child protective services to address the racial inequities in the Texas foster care system. Later they invested in the system. But what I would like to say, and why I truly believe that children and families cannot be whole and healthy as long as the system is in place the way it is. Because with all of the progress that we have made in many areas, there are still more who have experienced harm than not. right? And so, you know, we can say that we made progress. And I really attribute the progress that we made in Texas. We made some significant progress. The progress that we made was because we were willing to go to the root cause of the problem, to bring in undoing racism workshops, to begin to examine our data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, to hear the voices of the youth who were experiencing our systems, to hear from parents and community, and to allow them to tell us how they experienced our system, and to talk about what the system needed to do differently to best meet the needs. And so when I say turn the mirror inward, I'm very clear that I'm not talking about just at an individual level, because often systems will operate, and I believe in a way that is not accountable, by focusing only on individual implicit bias. Now, that is something that we all must do, but it is not sufficient for undoing institutional and structural racism. And so the model that I actually started developing it when I was still working in the regions and came with it to state office has various components that, if they're in place, they have a positive impact. But nowhere has it been able to be sustained. And which is one of the reasons why I'm committed to the fact that the systems as they are will never work to benefit any child, youth, or family, not just Black, right? Because I wouldn't suggest that it's doing the best work that it can do to serve any population, let alone the failure of systems to meet the needs of Black children, youth, and families. And so I would, you know, what I have done is I've gone in, I've introduced language around institutional and structural racism. I've tried to help people to get in touch with how we've been socialized to think about people based solely on the color of their skin, you know, such that they could even name communities where people live anywhere across this country, where if you examine the outcomes for people in those communities, you see that their outcomes are disparate in their relationships with all helping systems, and that those communities pretty much look the same all across the country, right? And so to begin to understand that from a place of not what's wrong with the people that live there or the people in those communities, but to understand their relationships with systems and institutions that have led and continue to lead to the outcomes that we see. So sometimes it sounds simple, but it's a building, a level of consciousness and an analysis of institutional and structural racism that becomes so clear that oftentimes it's the people that I'm engaging who can think and say, oh, well, you know, now I understand why this didn't work, right? Now I think we ought to be able, but there are so many years of embedded racism in our system that if we just think that to undo that is going to make the kind of change that we want, it won't happen, right? And so again, it won't happen. We cannot change the systems and institutions that are in place because of how they were originally set up. They will never transform to the outcomes that I believe social workers all across the country come to work every day to help and not to harm. And I approach my work from that belief. But I'm really trying to help people to see clearly, to understand how race and racism impacts how we work with families, how we work with youth, that we're still living to the socialized beliefs that some people's lives are not as valuable as others. And the examples that we can give of that are clearly in the data and outcomes that we see for the same people in every system and institution, right? Starting early. And I know Allegheny County is working a lot on looking at public education, right? And so Black children start early to internalize a sense of worthlessness, right? And it carries through because it gets reinforced over and over and over again. And then when they're involved with child welfare, it gets reinforced over and over and over, and builds into the trauma that, you know, we do such a poor job of raising children that when a former foster youth has a child of their own, that's considered a risk factor. What does that say about the system that raised the children and to now be mothers, right? And that it's a risk factor. And so we just have to really go deeper. We have treated the symptoms of problems all along in our systems and institutions. Rarely have we gone to the root cause to even understand the history. You know, when I was a caseworker, no one taught me about the impact of racism, right? Absolutely. When I became a caseworker, we had 3 national incident studies that said Black families did not abuse and neglect their children at a greater rate. No one said that to us in new worker training. And so if we have more Black families, it must mean they're abusing and neglecting their children. We have to get to the truth. We have to examine the lies, and we have to come to see clearly that we are not working in the best interest of children.
Absolutely. I think one of the conversations that we have in the BGEA work group, the child welfare work group, quite often is that the number of allegations that come in and is significantly higher to the number of substantiated reports that come in. And I remember, I think it's somewhere around 17%, and Alan actually talked about that too, when we're looking at the number of reports that come in, but the actual number of substantiated reports of children who are actually being abused. And we have talked about reports that have come in, things as minor and as basic as the grass was too high, you know what I mean? And we're talking about a possible investigation on the basis of the grass being too high. That just seems totally insane. Or a kid being up all night playing video games. There are significant challenges around that, and there is a need to really educate. And what we've been looking at is educating around harm reduction and helping people to understand the harm that is related to every time a child is removed from their home or an investigation is done unnecessarily for something like the grass is too high. And so, you know, can you speak a little bit about that? And this can go to anyone on, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, George, and it just brought to mind for me things like there's no food in the house, right? I looked in the fridge, there's no food. When you really get deep into engaging families, you'll hear things like, well, I don't have a car, so have you ever tried to take the bus to the grocery store, right? So how much can you buy at one time if you don't have transportation to and from the grocery store? And it's that kind of deep thinking and understanding that will help us to do things to keep children in their homes versus removing them from their families. At one point in our work in Texas, we were given TANF dollars to do a Strengthening Families initiative. And the intent was that we would use the money to serve families who came to the attention of the agency because of neglect, and poverty was an underlying factor. And it really was a successful intervention, a model. It was successful in that we could go into families and, for example, we could buy washers and dryers if they needed to have clean clothing. You could put a fence around the house if children were playing in the street. You could do car repairs if parents didn't have transportation to take their kids to the doctor or whatever. And so, you know, for me, but those things are often limited, right? And they're limited to the extent that they don't go as deep, and it's usually a trial. And that one actually became eliminated. It was one of the few models that we had where we didn't see racial inequities when we began to examine it. And so we were really going to the root cause and trying to make sure that we were keeping children safely in their own homes. And I'll also say that our work was questioned initially about raising the issues about racism and overrepresentation of Black children. The question was, well, are you saying that we should just leave Black children in unsafe situations? Because those are the beliefs that we have, right? We also saw that though Black families were reported at 2 to 3 times their representation in the general population, like you said, when we looked at those intakes, and when we accounted for those that truly met the statutory definition of abuse and neglect, we found that there was very little difference in terms of abuse by families across race and ethnic lines in Texas. We saw it pick up in those cases that we did investigate, right? We did a whole study looking at making factors the same. Single parents, poor, same or very similar allegations of abuse and neglect. And what we found was that we were more likely to remove Black children from their homes in the exact same or very similar situations where we provided in-home services to whites, right? And so we actually did a paper around race, risk, and poverty, Alan and myself and another colleague, but we really were clear that race is a strong predictor of our relationships, again, not only with child welfare, but with all of the other helping systems. And so it's really, really, but people don't have that level of consciousness. And most systems are not willing to do that deep analysis to get to where we say, what is it that's happening in the system that's creating the outcomes? Because, you know, I used to say we focus on fixing broken families when really it is the system that's broken, but the system is actually not broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it will not do anything different in its current form. And it cannot be transformed because of how it was designed and the resistance that exists inside. You know, just an aside, and I'll go here, but look at what happened when there was the push against systems and we began to see the political climate change. That's just an example of what we see in child welfare. The harder you push against the walls of resistant institutions, the more they fight back and double down. And that's one of the reasons why we will not see the change that we want to see unless we replace those systems, not with other systems, but with new anti-racism kinds of responses, with a new analysis and understanding, with the kind of training and professional development that people should have to even get their degrees to be social workers. And so systems have failed at every level to be accountable to children, youth, and families and the harm that has been done for far too long. There has never been a time in this country when we have not seen the racial inequities that we see for Black children, youth, and families. There's never been a time when it has not existed. And so what that says to us is that we can't solve the problem. We can't solve it, right? Now, let me just say one more thing though. We can't just tomorrow say, okay, it's over.
Right.
And so we have to have something in place to reduce the harm while we break down those institutional barriers, while we remove those fences, so that child welfare is not the option. It's not the answer, because now we have new things in place that support keeping children safe in their own homes, free of harm.
So I love that. I'm a bit of a problem solver. You've given us a lot. I do want to transition the conversation a little bit more. I want you to hold that thought. And I want to say to the audience, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat at this time. I see that we have Dr. V on, and she's saying that, you know, she even got a call that there was no fan in the house. And so, I think the state of Pennsylvania has been fully aware because they are looking at the curriculum for mandated child abuse reporter training, and they are really looking at how do they make changes. But when we talk about systemic change, there is the whole idea and the concept around people honestly believe that the communities that these children live in are not safe communities. And so therefore that child in that home can't be safe. I'm afraid to go into this community, so this child shouldn't live here. And so you touched on something I think that was real when you said that. And again, I think Tashara jumped on. Do we have any questions, Tashara?
We do. You were such an excellent moderator. You knew exactly why my face came on camera. So we have two questions, one from Dr. V, and she says, how do individual practitioners who contract with social service agencies change the system? In other words, some of us are in bed financially with the systems that do harm.
Wow, great question.
She didn't direct it to anyone specifically, so whoever wants to take it.
Or everybody can kind of take it and weigh in on that. Why don't we start with you, Maya?
Yeah, so I think that's a tough question, right? So if you're operating within a system and you don't want to do harm, what do you do? I don't know that I have all the answers for that, but I think that one thing that people can do is, as much as possible, think about the ways that their work is directly policing families and the ways that their work is leading to either longer investigations or removal of children from their homes. I think that especially as practitioners, there are so many avenues through which lead right back to family policing, right? So whether a parent told you something in confidence and now you're adding that to their case files and that's elevating. And so thinking about those things and thinking about what you're seeing and trying to interact with families in a way that is not further causing family policing and harm as much as possible, I think is where I'm at in terms of like, what do you do if you're working within a system right now?
So I would just say, because I do a lot of work with multiple systems and institutions across the country. And, my sincere intention is to try to help people to see the harm that's being done by systems and institutions. I firmly believe that people come to their work to help and not to harm. And I believe that when we can help people to get in touch with how we harm, that we can begin to lessen the harm while we work upstream to eliminate the need for the systems that do harm. And so exposing the harm becomes very important to me, because I can't tell you, I've done work even with hospitals and doctors around the harm for Black women and infants. And sometimes I wonder, well, what can I tell these people that they don't already know? They don't know about institutional and structural racism. And that's even trying to be limited, that they would even know about it, right? And so I'm intentional when I go in is to say, if that's not how you want to address these issues, then I'm not going to minimize it, because we have to understand the harm that we do in hopes that it'll create some new thinking and a new analysis and some new ways of going back and even revisiting decisions and bringing community in and seeing that there are resources and opportunities for children to live in their own families, in their own communities. And so, I mean, that's why I do it. And yes, I make money off of it. But the other thing that I do is that the work is so important to me that for people who can't afford to pay for it, the work is what's important. And, and I'm saying that because I have enough paying clients that I also do work because of the work. I've committed over 40 years of my career to trying to make right for the harm that I also engaged in when I didn't have a clear analysis and understanding. And so those of us who have that analysis and understanding, I think it is our obligation to go in and to try to make it right and try to begin to dismantle what's in place that's been causing harm for far too long.
I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit more, but I'm going to go to Alan, and then I want to come back to that, because I can't help but to sit here and to wonder, what comes to mind is when we know better, we got to do better. And so for, us, many of us that have been in the field for so long, I am going to reach out to you and say, how do we make those small changes to do better? But Alan, I'm going to ask that you weigh in on Dr. V's question and give us some input and your thoughts around it as well.
Yeah, I think I always struggle with this question because I recognize that there are financial considerations to it, and people can't just quit their jobs. So when it comes to individual people, in terms of thinking about their role, I would ask people to think, why did they get into this work? What was the goal of what they wanted to accomplish? And for most people, that's helping children and families in some way. And then look at the agency around you, look at the environment you're in, and ask yourself, is that what's happening? Are children and families being helped, or are children and families being harmed? And then I think the decisions about what to do about that have to be at the individual level. But ultimately, I think that in a bigger picture sense, I think that social workers particularly, because of our values, social workers, our code of ethics says that as social workers, we must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. That means we have to take action against the systems that are responsible for oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. And the child welfare system is responsible for those things. My view is that social workers should not just disavow the child welfare system, but refuse to be complicit in the harms that it causes and leave employment entirely with the child welfare system. I think that social workers have been fooled by the idea that we can create change from the inside. And that's what we tell ourselves in terms of why we stay, because we think we can create change from the inside. I think that the idea of creating change from the inside is a lie that white supremacy culture wants us to believe, because it keeps us complicit in the harm that the system is causing. We've tried to create change from the inside for decades in child welfare systems, with the police, in prisons, and that change isn't happening. I just think the concept of creating change from the inside is a lie that we've been told in order to keep us committing harm and keep us taking actions that are maintaining oppression. So I ultimately think that social workers, practitioners that really care about children and families need to remove ourselves from the system that's causing harm to those children and families.
Wow. Okay. And I think that we are starting to see a shortage in caseworkers now, even as you're speaking. I'm not sure if that's the reason why, but the numbers are low. So I have another question, and this is from Marsha. It says, is anyone aware of a court system that has taken steps to address these insights?
Well, I've worked with several court systems that have tried to take steps. And the one that I had the most involvement with was actually in Texas through the Supreme Court Judicial Commission on Children, Youth, and Families, who we were able to engage in conversations around institutional and structural racism, to the extent that we were able to even bring in several times the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to do undoing racism workshops. We were able to get judges to begin to look at their data and decisions by race and ethnicity and look at outcomes. I don't know of anywhere where that work has been done in a way where it has brought about the kind of change that we need to see from the courts in regard to the relationships that courts have with child welfare systems, that courts and child welfare systems have with juvenile justice. And so it's like, I say the water is polluted in all the systems. And I really know that you can clean it up a little bit over here, and then it just gets recontaminated over and over and over and over again. And so I want to also say that, just going back a minute, that I agree with Alan about position that social workers should take. And in the work that I'm doing, there have been some places where I haven't seen the level of commitment to change that I would like to see, and invest in my time and energy to the extent that I've chosen not to renew my contracts with some of those places because I'm in it for change. And, I'm in it for people to be in it for the long haul while we're working upstream to something different. And where I haven't seen that, then I've chosen not to renew my contracts with those counties and even states. And so courts have to be a part of this, because even when child welfare systems try to put something in place that's more about family and children being safe, if there's not that same kind of analysis and understanding from all of the systems that touch the children, youth, and families, then that's another fence that keeps getting put up and stifling the work and continuing the harm. So I haven't seen it at the level that it needs to be. And there's a lot of work that courts need to do no more harm to children, youth, and families.
So there's a couple of questions that are coming through, or comments that I think are worth paying some attention to. But I think there's also this concern that what do we, because what I would hear a lot of times, working in this field for long, is that we don't have any place for children to go. And there was this immediate thought that it was unsafe for that child to be at home. And I'm looking at those cases where maybe there might have been a safety threat, or there was a safety threat. And so where are the challenges? And for a long time, I would always say that, every child has 100 resources, mother's side of the family, father's side of the family, and then community and churches as well. But there is that thought, I think, that scares a lot of people that work in this field. Well, what do we do? Because right now, we can't send the children home. That might be a thought. So what do we do? So I'm going to ask you to respond to that. Then I'm going to go to the chat and pull out some of those.
Well, we've disempowered communities. And so one of the things that we can do is be in relationship with communities, in genuine relationships with communities, with faith-based institutions. Because if we know our history, especially as it relates to Black children, youth, and families, is that before we had access to all of the things that supposedly are in our best interest now, that it was the community that took care of children. And when systems went in, we disempowered those communities from being able to work in the ways. And so and if we only see deficits and danger and criminals and drugs in those communities, then we will never develop the kind of relationships that will allow children to be in their community. So we have to reestablish. We have to open the door for communities to tell us what they need from us to take care of their own children and families.
And so that goes back to those conversations that Maya was talking about earlier on, having those conversations, asking people, listening to what it is that they need. Maya, did you have any thoughts on that?
I was going to say something similar, and thinking about what would you do if you had a conflict within your family? There are times when, especially I've worked with older youth, teenagers are not getting along with their parents, they're running away, they have all these issues. But that ultimately really boils down to a conversation, what's bothering you. And maybe there is a safer place for that child to stay. But that doesn't mean that a system needs to come in and remove and cause harm and trauma. That means that you have to engage with people, ask them what they need, and make a plan the same way that we would with our own children, with our own family members. And another thing that I'll just say to this point is that I like to refocus on the fact that most of the children in the child welfare system are not entering because these extreme cases of abuse and neglect and because of the extreme harm that's happening in their homes. So we cannot try to build other mechanisms, build other systems based on things that just aren't happening, right? These are very rare circumstances where that's happening. So a justification for the system remaining is not that children are unsafe in their homes, right? There are small cases of that happening, which are serious cases, but small cases. And we shouldn't have a system built around this fear that people are inherently going to harm their children. Most parents and families, the vast majority, want to do the best by their children. So the question really is, how do we make sure that people have the supports that they need so that they can do the best by their children within their communities and without state involvement?
The one thing that we know too, Maya, is that children, even once they go into adoptive homes, even once they've been removed from their birth families for a period of time, they somehow find their way back to that birth family, that family of origin. So they go right back there, whether it be that they turn 18, there have been many stories. And by that time, there's been so much time that has lapsed that we really have done damage to that relationship as well. So thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
I'm going to just shoot over. Go ahead. Were you going to say something else, Maya?
In my experience in working with children, the one thing that they always ask me is, when can mom get better? When can I go back home? When I want to talk to her, I want to talk about these things. I want to get this off my chest. I want to repair that relationship. Kids want to go home and they want that home to be a happy place. And I think that we really have an obligation to make sure that they can stay there.
Allegheny County has something called the YSP unit. And one of the things that I remember when we first started to look at this work with reducing our numbers with congregate care is going over and having a conversation with them. And there were two things that they said to me that I'll never forget. One, I already have a family, so do what you can do to try to support my family that I already have. I'm not interested in going into another one. The second thing that they said is they felt that we had messed up so bad in child welfare that you're not going to keep switching me from household to household to household. If it didn't work, stop right there. So I remember, that being, a comment, a gentleman said to me, get it right the first time, and the other comment was, I already have a family, that family needs support. And those things have always kind of stuck with me through the work. And I have, been an advocate for children being connected to family. So I think that, thank you for sharing what you said, Maya. We always got to remember to listen to the children and listen to the family and listen to what they're saying. Adela from the chat says that everyone in the child welfare system is not a social worker. Many can take jobs in this field without being a social worker. Because Joyce, you talked about social workers being in this field. So when that came through, I thought about, so what is the responsibility of the child welfare agency to train those people who are not social workers so that they have that diversity training? Is that at the forefront of the curriculum as people come in? What about those walks in the community so that people understand that there are treasures in the community? There are, just not, crime and violence. There are a lot of great things that happen in these communities that you wouldn't know about if you don't exist. So what is the obligation of the child welfare system to make sure that the people are trained in such a way that, prevents anti-bias?
It's not just social workers. There is no discipline that requires its members to have a clear analysis and understanding of institutional and structural racism to get an undergraduate, graduate, or advanced degree, right? Not judges, not people who are going to be lawyers, who are going to deal with people's lives. So all of our systems produce racially inequitable outcomes, regardless of the discipline. But there is no requirement that they have a clear analysis of the history of those systems and the understanding of their relationships as, to race and racism. And so it's not just social workers. I often mention social workers because we work in most all of those helping systems. And actually the preparation for that should come before we go to work in the system, right? And so an accountable system who has a clear analysis will know that we start to get socialized at a very early age. We come with the old attitudes, assumptions, and stereotypes. And so if we're not doing something now in the current system to introduce it at new worker training, even in how we recruit folks, that we're sending a message about what we expect, what kind of culture they're going to be working in, then we're failing individuals. It's not the fault of the individual who goes out, right, and does something that people call racist or whatever, and I'm not excusing individual accountability, but where is the institutional accountability for building people up with the right knowledge and understanding about history and culture and racism to develop the kind of lens that we take to communities when we go out and do an investigation, right? When we can get in touch with the reality of where does this fear come from? Why do I think all Black people are dangerous and abusive and all of these things that, I don't even have to live in the communities where disproportionately children are removed from poor communities. I just have to look like them to have the same experience with any system and institution that I have to stand before. That's how powerful racism is in terms of how it still operates and is creating harm that has never been eliminated from the days of enslavement.
So I see Tashara popped on. Thank you, Joyce, for sharing that, giving us that insight. Tashara, I do want to go to Angela's question because I think it's important. And then I know you're on because you want to shift so that we go into really being more solution oriented. But Angela's question is back.
Wait, 1 second, Tawanda. I'm so sorry. I don't know if you knew that our webinar was scheduled to end at 2:30 and not 3.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so I wanted to flag that because
want to keep them forever.
Exactly. Because my thought going when I saw Angie's question, like you, was we have to address this, but I also don't want to do it a disservice, knowing that we probably need to do a part 2 to this discussion. And so
Absolutely.
Not at all trying to hold our panelists hostage, but there is so much to dissect here. So I just wanted to flag that to Wanda.
Right. I like the idea of doing a part 2 and really coming back with some things that they have done already in this work to move in that direction, and really looking at how we can further the work that we're currently doing to support these efforts for our young people and for families. And I think Angela's question actually is a tie-in to what we might do when we talk about how do we make those, changes on an individual level, but hoping that they impact systemically. And she just wants to know if we can't quit, our work as, a professional in the child welfare setting, what can we do to support children and families?
I'll answer that one really quickly, and we can talk about it, another time. But the question is, if those of us who care remove ourselves, what will our families be left with? I would ask you, what are families left with now with social workers in the system? With social workers in the system, families are left with a system that is causing immense trauma and harm to them, forever terrorizing them and changing the dynamics of their families, and in many cases, permanently destroying those families. That's what families have now with social workers in the system. I think social workers removing themselves from the system takes a professional stance that we're just not going to do this anymore, which is what we need to happen to get closer to abolition.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask Maya the same thing.
My response is really the same. I think that sometimes we have this idea that if we're not there individually and at this point collectively, like what will happen? But I also would ask the question, where would your energy be better directed if you were working outside of that system? And where would your energy be better directed at actually helping children and families if you were not within the system and had the opportunity to build outside of the system? When your energy is being absorbed and your time is being absorbed and working with a harmful institution, you don't have the energy to do the other things. So I think sometimes we're scared to take that leap, but there are so many things outside of the system, especially as social workers, that they can be doing to support families and to support communities and get us closer to abolition.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Tashara to put the poll up. And then Joyce, can you just
Yes, please.
Thank you.
I would have to say that I believe that we still need social workers inside of the system, but we need a change mindset. We need them organizing inside of systems. We need them pushing against the walls of resistant and racist institutions while we're building a stronger force external to the system, right, to tear down those institutional walls that have continued to harm children, youth, and families. And, you know, to look at it realistically, to me, as, you know, some people livelihoods, I mean, we have to know that their livelihoods, they have families of their own. And sometimes that's how the system causes us to conform, is that they socialize us to certain models of practice and beliefs that if we push too hard against the walls of the system, right, then we risk losing our jobs and feeding our families. And so if we organize around a common analysis and understanding of what we want the system to be, we can push against the walls of institutions while at the same time we're organizing externally. So social workers, I believe, need to work inside, but we also need to do more to work outside of the system to push against the walls and until they come down, right? And we have eliminated the harm that systems have done to our children, youth, and families.
So I want to say, as people were completing the poll, thank you to you, Joyce, Alan, and Maya. You were a great panelist. This was a great discussion. So great that we're going to need to have a part two because we really need to go even deeper in this. So I'm going to say to our audience, look forward to a part two because we will be inviting them back. Please take a minute to continue to fill out the poll. And there's only 5 questions. We're at 2:31. So Amy, you can go ahead and close out the poll. I am hoping that everyone had an opportunity to complete it. Again, a special thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for tuning in with us today, to Amy for always working our technology out, and to Shira for supporting us with everything that you do. All right, and the poll questions are up. So 48% of the group said that they're very comfortable. 48% of the group said comfortable with the topic of child welfare. So changed a little from before. Only 4% said they were uncomfortable. A lot of people didn't answer the very comfortable piece. And then, okay, no, that was part 1. So only a few people said they were uncomfortable too. 52% said that they feel the child welfare system can be fixed. 26% not sure. And then 22% said it can't be fixed. And our panelists say it can't be fixed because we have to start over again and do something new. And then 22% for abuse allegations come into the child welfare system. 78% said neglect allegations. Children come into the child welfare system. And then, do you believe in abolishing the child welfare system? 74% of the people said yes, and 26% of the people said no. So, let's see, I think that was our last question. I don't have a question number 5 out here. So we definitely swayed the audience in some degree. So maybe we need to do more of these. Certainly look forward to a part 2. Thank you everyone for joining. And we are going to go ahead and close out this particular session.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.